In my opening presentation, I pointed out that Islam's doctrine of God is far from the pure monotheism it boasts of, and is in fact in violation of its own criteria of what counts as pure monotheism. You'll notice that Shabir kept saying that we need a common definition of monotheism. The point that I'm making in this debate is that the Quran lays down its own criteria, and if the Quran violates that, then by its own stipulated definitions, it isn't what it boasts of, and therefore is completely false. But by way of response, notice that Shabir has unwittingly demonstrated this contention in a number of ways. In the first place, Shabir engaged in what is known in logic as a tu quoque fallacy. That's where a person says, I don't have a problem because you have the same problem. Or you have the problem, but to a greater degree, right? According to Shabir, we have the same problem as Christians. Well, remind me, what does Shabir believe the doctrine of the Trinity is? He believes it's shirk. Shabir has just told you that he has this. We have the same problem he does. The problem of shirk? That's the very issue we're debating. Does Islam teach pure monotheism? Shabir's defense is, well, you have the same problem. As Christians, we believe that God came and became incarnate, right? We don't believe that God, as God, had human attributes or qualities. It's not part of Christ's divine nature. But in Shabir, to justify the Quran and Sunnah's definition of Allah having these parts, he says, well, you have that problem too. Okay, we have that problem too. I don't think it's a problem. I'm not a Muslim. I don't reject the incarnation. I don't define that as a violation of anything that's true. That's what Islam teaches. So what I'm pointing out is Islam doesn't live up to its own criteria. It is internally contradictory, right? It leaves us with an admission from Shabir that it doesn't teach pure monotheism, and it doesn't teach anti-anthropomorphic views about God. Now, I don't agree with Shabir when he says that we have the same problem, by the way. Perhaps it wasn't clear to Shabir in our previous debate. Now let me make it a bit more clear. Even though we're not debating the Trinity, I'm going to grant him this favor. The Christian doctrine of the Trinity is not that there are three gods in addition to each other, like Muslims who have these attributes that are additional to each other and additional to the essence. The persons of the Trinity are numerically identical to the essence. They are consubstantial, subsistent relations. They co-inhere in the one essence. It's not that the Father has certain attributes and the Son has certain attributes and the Spirit. They possess the same divine identity, the same essence. So it's not the same thing. And when we say that God became a man, notice we're saying became a human being. Shabir, as a Muslim, if he is going to deal with these things as the early Muslims did, and as I think the sources clearly teach, has to say these things are true of Allah from all eternity. Allah from eternity has had a face. Allah from eternity has had hands, two right hands. Allah from eternity has had loins or gonads or whatever term you choose to use for that. In fact, it's not just, notice, I'm not trying to be offensive. I want people to see the truth of this, and I want Shabir to see it. I want other Muslims to see it. When you affirm these sorts of things for your deity, you're saying he's not God at all. A being who has these attributes or qualities can't even be the creator of heaven and earth. If he has hands, and I don't care what kind of hands you want to say, right? The hands of a clock or the hands of a arm on a record player are different than the hands of my hands, which are different from the hands of a baboon. Okay, but in any case, any kind of hands that you're talking about presuppose a context within which they exist. They presuppose that sort of thing. We're told in various hadith, for example, that Allah put his palm between Muhammad's shoulder blades, and Muhammad felt its coolness in his chest. Allah put his hand between Muhammad's shoulder blades. That's about the extent of Allah's hand. Now, maybe it can blow up and become bigger, other things. But the fact is, it's circumscribed. It has limits. It presupposes space within which to exist. Allah then can't be the creator of space. Well, now, Shabir rejects this teaching of the early Muslims, the muhaddithun, the traditionists who took these things literally. Right? And why did they take them literally, by the way? Because, as I said, I didn't simply rely on the hadith, right? But I also didn't reject the hadith. I think I'm more of a Sunni than apparently Shabir is. I don't reject the Sunnah of Muhammad, his hadiths. Muhammad, in Surah 38:75 says Allah created Adam with his own two hands. This is what set Adam apart from every other creature. That's why the additional statements in the hadith from Muhammad, which we would expect to be more detailed. Anytime you have additional statements made, they're more detailed. That's not an argument against their veracity. We didn't even get an argument against their veracity, by the way. We heard that there were some people making up hadith, and so, we could just throw things out. Yeah, there were people making up hadith. That's why we have hadith collections like Sahih Bukhari, saying we've applied this criteria and we've come to the conclusion that these are sound narrations. These are authoritative traditions. What evidence were we given not to trust these traditions? Right now, I would be happy with Shabir to throw out these hadith. But guess what? The same Muslims who gave us the hadith that Shabir says we can just throw out because they're unreliable and they made things up, those are the same people that handed down the Quran to us. Okay, let's throw them out. We shouldn't trust them. They're a bunch of fabricators. Okay, throw out the Quran along with it. I'd be happy with that. I would consider that a good resolution of our discussion, our debate. Now, but what about that stuff about Allah's hands? I mean, is that just metaphorical? Again, the hadith say this is Adam's distinguishing, quality. He was created by Allah's hands. The hadiths go on and emphasize this even more. That's why the early traditionists said this. Now, he doesn't accept Assad's view, where you just divest Allah of all his attributes, which was also the view of the Mu'tazili and the Jahmiyyah and all the others. He rejects that, and I'm happy he does so, but that doesn't get him out of the problem. My whole point was all three of these positions are problems. The position of the early traditionists, that Allah has attributes, including loins and two right hands and a foot and a shin and so forth, that was a problem because it means Allah is made up of parts, including parts that presuppose a spatio-temporal environment in which he exists, and so couldn't be the creator of that. And also the Ash'ari resolution of that, Shabir says he has no problem with that. It's not a problem to say Allah's attributes are not he and not other than he. Well, my goodness, that's the very definition of a logical contradiction. It violates one of the most basic fundamental laws of thought. In fact, Hamza Yusuf, an Orthodox Sunni Muslim, in his book on the Creed of Imam al-Tahawi, admits that this statement of al-Ash'ari, that his attributes are not he and not other than he says that it's a paradox, and he says, in effect, what the Muslim has to do is square a circle in his mind. He's advocating this. I can assure you, folks, anybody who thinks he's squaring circles is not being rational. He's engaging, in, by definition, in irrationality. So no, I do not believe that Islam teaches pure monotheism. Not in any sense. Not in any of these three ways. And I don't think that al-Ash'ari's resolution is a sound one. Now, again, go back to the notion that, now all Muslims, by the way, except for the Mu'tazili, believe that the Quran is eternal. Let's just stick with that as an example. Forget Allah's two right hands. Forget his shin. Forget his loins. Forget the fact that there was a primordial womb that reached up and grabbed Allah's loins, according to Sahih Bukhari, 3 times. Forget that it's also found in Ahmed bin Hanbal's Musnad, volume 14. Forget all of that. Okay, forget that unsightly business. And by the way, it is unsightly business because even if you look at the English translations of Muhammad Mushin Khan and others, they completely strike this from the English. They're embarrassed by this, appropriately. But forget all of that. Just consider the Quran for a moment. The Quran is not Allah, according to Muslims. It's something other than Allah. It's not the creator, but it wasn't created. There's another eternal thing besides their deity. Folks, that is not pure monotheism. It is not pure monotheism, and it's not what Christians mean when we say that Jesus is the Word of God. Jesus is not something other than the Creator. He is the Creator. We don't believe that he's an additional thing in addition to the Father. They share the same divine essence. But in Islam, these attributes are something other than the essence. They're not the same thing. So, no, we don't have the same problem. Yes, Muslims do have this problem, and that's why I call it shirk, shorn, or sham. You're either guilty of shirk, asserting a plurality for your deity, including anthropomorphic qualities like loins, or you have to divest your deity of all attributes, in which case he becomes an unknowable being, and certainly not an object of worship, or you have to engage in self-contradiction in order to pacify yourself and pretend that you're not really violating your own criteria, your own belief system. Okay? This is not simply a problem that can be swept away. And it's certainly, it's no answer to the problem. If I'm in a boat and somebody says your boat is sinking, and I say, oh yeah, well your boat's sinking too. Well, that doesn't help me at all. I need a life raft. Somebody get me out of here. I'll tell you how you can get out of here. Confess the only true triune God who revealed himself through the prophets and the apostolic writings. That God is absolutely one in his essence. All three persons possess the divine essence, wholly, without partition, without division. That's the Orthodox doctrine of the Trinity. Okay? That's not something I made up and so forth. That's what Christians have always believed. Christians have always believed that God is one in essence. Okay? I know there have been heresies throughout history, but those heresies have been definitively responded to by Christians. As a reminder, Shabir said, what constitutes shirk is thinking that there are other beings that can be interceded through. Well, remember, I quoted the hadith. We heard no response to this, that the Quran is going to be an intercessor for Muslims. And this is, I'm being, entirely charitable here. Magnificent. The Quran is only one of the many things that are going to intercede for Muslims on the day of resurrection. But Shabir admitted that that's shirk. Okay, so here you have an eternal thing that's going to intercede for Muslims. He's going to appear as a pale man, we're told, according to the hadith. So a pale man is going to intercede for Muslims, an eternal thing. Right? He said that Christians have the additional problem because we believe in a plurality of persons, right? Doesn't this sound to you like a person? The Quran is a pale man interceding for people? And even if it's not a person, do you remember how Shabir broke down different positions regarding theism? He spoke about henotheism, he spoke about monolatry, and then he spoke about monotheism. Monotheism is belief in one God. What is henotheism? It's a belief in additional eternal things besides the one God, but only worshiping one. So pretend that Muslims do only worship one of these eternal entities. That's not pure monotheism, even by Shabir's definition. It's henotheism. But just because they don't call a cat doesn't mean that it's not. The fact that they don't say they worship the Quran or these other attributes doesn't mean they don't. If they can be used to intercede with Allah, then it does constitute shirk. The Quran chided the pagans for this very view. Muhammad in the Quran chided the pagans repeatedly for thinking that there were intercessory deities who could avail with Allah. Well, that's the very thing Muslims are saying. When they say the Quran is eternal, it can be an intercessor. And remember, it's not just the Quran, it's every single one of Allah's attributes. All of them are viewed as hypostatic entities that exist in addition to each other, in addition to the divine essence. I know some of this can seem abstract and philosophical and so forth, but I hope you understand this is the sort of challenge that Muslims for centuries have made against Christianity. And they've gotten away with murder, really. Because it's not Christians who have the problem here. Christians do not set up these faulty standards of what counts as true monotheism. And we don't set up absurd answers to try and get out of the conundrum. Allah's attributes are not he and not other than he. We don't have to reject our own sources because they're so embarrassing. We don't have to try and cover up unsightly business about Allah's loins. We don't have to do that sort of thing. We are confident in embracing our sources. I entirely embrace all those passages that talk about Jesus becoming a man and dying a humiliating, agonizing death. I know that for Muslims, that's scandalous, but isn't that what the New Testament says? That it's a stumbling block to unbelievers? That's what I believe as a Christian. That's what God did. But God had to do that. Don't forget this. God had to do that. He had to take a human nature on himself. He didn't always have hands. He didn't always have loins. He didn't always have a shin. And by the way, some of this gets pretty, and I'm not trying to be offensive. Some of this gets downright absurd because many of these Muslims who take these things literally will say that the sources you might be assuming Allah has 2 legs or 2 feet. No, the Muslims who take this stuff literally say Allah has 1 shin. He has 1 shin, just like he has 2 right hands. The Islamic sources lead them to these sorts of beliefs. But even if you take all of this away, again, the point I keep hammering, you're still left with an affirmation of a plurality of attributes that are in addition to Allah's essence. They're not his essence. They're something other than the essence. The Quran, if I were to hold it up here, the Quran, none of you would say it's Allah. Shabir would not say it's Allah. But he would have to confess that it's eternal and uncreated, like Allah. The Quran says to Christians, say not 3. I say to Muslims, say not 2. In fact, again, the Quran is only one of his attributes. They say Allah has 99 names, so at least 99 corresponding attributes. Say not 99. We've got a worse problem than Muslims. Say not 99. I'll say 3 all day long as Muslims are saying 99 and calling my belief in the Trinity polytheism. Okay? And I'll conclude with that.
Reverend Rogers, you can begin your 10-minute rebuttal.
Thank you very much. Shabir began by saying that I misdefined henotheism, but then he gave the very definition that I was working in terms of. Henotheism is not a rejection of other gods. It's the insistence or affirmation of the existence and actually, I have the same definition I think that he had. It's the worship of a single overarching God while not denying the existence or possible existence of other deities. Well, what is it to say that there are other things in addition to Allah that are eternal and uncreated? That's what most people mean by a deity. And it's certainly not absolute unity. If you say that there are a multiplicity of subsistent things, entities, in addition to Allah, such as the Quran and all the other 99 plus attributes of Allah, you are affirming henotheism, at least henotheism. That is not pure monotheism by any definition. Now, Shabir has said, on the one hand, that he believes that the resolution come to or arrived at by Asharis is a paradox. He says it's a paradox. We got to deal with this. But then he turns around and he says, I believe this is a very reasonable explanation. I don't think he even knows what the definition of paradox is. The whole point of it, to say something's a paradox is to say I haven't got a reasonable resolution of this. And my point wasn't that this is merely a paradox. My point is that this is a flagrant contradiction. You can't say the Quran is something other than Allah and not other than Allah. That is not rationally coherent. And as soon as you start thinking that that sort of thing is, I can assure you, you're going to have all sorts of other problems. You know, thieves have a tendency to think this way. This is not my wallet. It's not the case that it's not my wallet, right? That's how thieves think, right? That is not rational thinking. It's criminal thinking. And it's criminal, especially when we talk about God. If you're going to reason that way, then you're admitting that your position is terribly flawed and altogether false. Now, I already explained to Shabir that this isn't the same issue that Christians have. He keeps going back to this. As a Christian, I don't believe, he said 99 times 3, right? 99 attributes, because each person has these attributes. As Christians, we do not believe that the Son possesses different attributes of the Father that can be added to the Father's attributes. This is just gross straw man of the Christian position. Shabir, in our earlier debate, quoted the Athanasian Creed. He quoted other creeds. He quoted the Nicene Creed, which says the Son is homoousios, one essence, the same essence. Not the Son possesses the same kind of essence, like you possess human nature, but you're numerically other than the other person, essentially. No, the persons of the Trinity possess the entirety of the divine essence. They're not partitioned. They're not divided. All 3 persons co-inhere in the one divine essence. This is not the same thing as you find in Islam. And Shabir says, well, we've got a problem because we say that Jesus became a man. Yeah, I affirm that. I say Jesus became a man. He has not always been a man, and his humanity is not the same as his deity. And he misrepresented at least what I believe as an Orthodox Protestant, and what even the whole Western and Eastern Church, apart from later Protestantism, has always believed. Completely misrepresented this when he said that as Christians, we believe Jesus gave up one of his attributes and so forth. There might be some who have said that. It's certainly not what I would say. When Jesus in Mark 13:32 says, no man knows the day or the hour, not the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone, I take the word know there according to its declarative sense, its causative meaning. In other words, Jesus is saying, I don't declare that day. That prerogative belongs to the Father. That term is used that way repeatedly in the Old Testament and even in the New. In 1 Corinthians 2, Paul said to the Corinthians, I resolve to know nothing among you except Christ and him crucified. Was Paul saying he literally didn't know other things? No, he's saying this is what I'm declaring to you. What Jesus is referring to there is the wedding custom in Jewish culture, where it was the prerogative of a father to declare the day the son would go get his bride. It didn't mean the son didn't literally cognitively know that day, but he didn't know it in the sense of have the prerogative to declare it. That's how that term is used. That's how I understand it. I also think it was a misrepresentation of Philippians 2 to say the Son divested himself of the attribute of knowledge. Philippians 2 doesn't say that. Philippians 2 says existing, huparchon. It means that he continued to exist in the form of God, even when he humbled himself and took on the nature of a servant. He didn't get rid of anything, he added something. He added a human nature, so he didn't divest himself of a single attribute. What about God, even under the Old Testament, speaking of himself using human terms? I didn't reject that. I already anticipated it in my opening presentation. My opening presentation, I said as a Christian, I adamantly affirm that the God of the Bible can condescend and enter into his creation and appear in palpable ways to his creatures. But the Bible is clear that God, apart from these condescensions, doesn't have these characteristics or qualities. God is spirit, according to Scripture, John 4:24. God is present in heaven, on earth, and under the earth, Psalm 139. God fills heaven and earth, Jeremiah 23. That's the nature of God, according to the Bible. These other things are talking about God voluntarily condescending and appearing, a theophanic appearance. That's not what's happening in Islam. Muslims say Allah can't enter into his creation. How many times have you all heard that from Muslims? He can't enter into his creation. So there is no condescension on Allah's part. When the Quran, not just the Hadith, when the Quran says Allah has eyes, it's referring to it's referring to what Allah is from eternity. It's not a condescension. It says that Allah has eyes. It says that Allah has a face that can be seen. Surah 75, 22 through 23 says some faces will be radiant on that day looking at their Lord. So people are going to see Allah. Well, here's a question for you. If people are going to see Allah on the day of resurrection, are they going to see all of him or only part of him? If they could see all of him, then that would mean they're infinite, wouldn't it? If their vision could encompass him, which would make them gods, which would be what? Shirk. If they say they won't see all of Allah, they'll only see part of him, what does that mean? It means Allah consists of parts. He's not absolutely one. What do you call that? Shirk. Allah has partners no matter how you slice and dice it. Allah is not absolutely one. Not according to the Quran, not according to the Hadith. Now, again, I have to call Shabir out on not being a good Sunni. Shabir says that I'm just wrong, he can reject hadith and so forth. The people who say you can reject certain hadith say there are criteria for this. Okay, what are the criteria to reject the hadith that I've referred to? A number of the hadith, when I referred to the hadith of intercession going to Adam because he was created directly with Allah's hands, which Shabir says, oh yeah, that teaches he has hands, so we throw that out. That hadith is mass narrated. It's a mutawatir hadith. It's one of the strongest hadiths you can find. The hadith that I mentioned about Allah's loins, that hadith is found in Sahih Bukhari, number 6830, 6831, 6832. It's found in Ahmed's Musnad. There are 4 separate chains of transmitters. Okay, if these people are unreliable, then throw out the Quran along with it. Okay, we need criteria to just say, this is reliable, that's not reliable. I don't accept this. And he says, Aisha, for example, rejected certain hadith. How does he know what Aisha did? Isn't he presupposing that he can rely on the hadith that tell us that she rejected certain things? Over and over again, I think that Islam has to desperately do certain things in order to avoid an obvious conundrum. Their religion does not teach pure monotheism, and why doesn't it? Why doesn't it? Because it's a departure from what was taught by the prophets and the apostles. The Quran says, if this Quran were from someone other than Allah, Surah 4, you'd find in it much contradiction. I've found much contradiction. Because it's not from Allah. It's not from the true God, the one they call Allah. The true God revealed himself through the prophets and apostles. That God is triune. That God exists as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, as we especially heard earlier. Again, I think that the Islamic sources reduce Muslims to one of 3 options. Either you say that Allah has a plurality of attributes, which is shirk, or you reject Allah's attributes in order to say that you don't believe in the plurality, but then you end up with a deity that's undefinable and unknowable, and therefore not even worship. How can you worship such a being? And by the way, how's that any different from the non-existent? The non-existent is undefinable, unknowable, right? What is the non-existent? It has no qualities, no attributes. Well, then maybe Allah is simply non-existent. This is not pure monotheism, right? And the Asharite solution to this is not a solution. When Hamza Yusuf said it's a paradox, and other Muslims, Shabir said it's a paradox. It is not a paradox. It's a contradiction. Okay? He said that we're squaring the circle, right? We're trying to say that Jesus has these contradictory things. No. As Christians, we say Jesus is both God and man, 2 distinct natures. When I say that Christ has the attributes of God and the attributes of deity, I'm not positing them of the same thing. His divine nature is not his human nature. When I say that Christ is a divine person and having a divine nature is omniscient and omnibenevolent and omnipotent and omniscient or omnipresent, I'm referring to his eternal divine nature. I'm not saying that nature is both present and not present, and vice versa for the human nature of Christ. And I'll conclude with that.
Thank you, Reverend Rogers. Now,
Okay, what have we seen in this debate? Well, we've seen a number of logical fallacies. The tu quoque fallacy. Yeah, I've got a problem, but you've got it too. Maybe even worse than I do. I've answered that numerous times now, and Shabir, in the response to me, has engaged in another fallacy, or at least what would be called a propaganda technique, to merely reassert the original claim that I refuted. Okay? The doctrine of the Trinity does not mean what he's talking about. And I've already said that numerous times, so I don't need to repeat it. The doctrine of the incarnation does not mean what he said. He tried to come back and say, no, the Son doesn't have knowledge, and it doesn't mean declare, it's not being used in the declarative sense there. But notice that was an assertion. He didn't give you an argument, he gave you an assertion. That's a propaganda technique. Okay, when somebody asserts something and pretends that because they've asserted it many times and very forcefully, that makes it true. Well, no, that doesn't make it true. Right? It might work in commercials, but it shouldn't work in rational debate. Okay? The reason that I said it means that, I gave you a reason. Contextually, it's talking about Jesus returning for his bride. In a Jewish wedding context, it was a father who declared, made known a day or the day that the son would go for his bride. Okay? That's how Jesus is using the term there. That's the context, going for his bride. So we've seen tu quoque fallacy. We've heard the straw man fallacy. We've also seen that that Islam's answer or solution to this problem is really it reduces to absurdity. Another logical fallacy, a reductio ad absurdum, where a person, in order to try and get out of a problem, will adopt something that's rationally incoherent. It is rationally incoherent to say that Allah's attribute, like the Quran, is not Allah, and yet it's not other than Allah. What is it? If it's not the Creator, what is it? It's something other than the Creator. If it's something other than the Creator, what is it? Well, it's not Allah, but it's eternal. Where did this eternal thing come from if it's not Allah? And what about all of its other partners? The Quran has partners, like seeing. Supposedly, according to the early traditionists, Allah's attribute of seeing can be present. His eyes are somehow here, while Allah's somewhere else. His eyes are gallivanting in places that Allah wouldn't. That's not, folks, pure monotheism. It's pure shirk. It's a violation of the very things that the Quran says constitutes pure monotheism. He said that hands could be meant literally, or they could simply be metaphorical for Allah's power. Well, how is that for a clear revelation of God? He's not sure if it's metaphorical or literal. Well, I'm sure that it's literal, but either way, I still have a problem with this. I'm sure that it's literal because that's how the Quran uses it in Surah 38:75 with respect to the hands, for example. And the hadiths, which we have no reason to reject, and all good evidence in support of them to affirm. He said that, the hadith aren't, the ones I cited aren't mutawatir. But go look it up. They're mutawatir. It's hard to find another hadith that is as plentifully narrated as this one. The hadith of intercession, where it talks about Allah's hands and Adam being created with Allah's hands. We're told, in fact, that according to Surah 7, that Allah brought forth from Adam's back his progeny, right, and caused them to stand before him. Before we were ever made, we were all brought out of Adam's back. Allah stroked Adam's back according to the Quran and hadith, and took out these progeny. So Allah stroked Adam's back with his hand, right? These things are quite literal, and these are well established. I do agree that there has to be criteria for what we accept or reject. That's the criteria that goes into forming Sahih Bukhari. It's called Sahih for a reason, because they applied the criteria. We didn't hear any good reason to reject these particular hadiths from Shabir. I think the Quran violates its own standards in numerous ways, no matter how you cut it. Even if we reject this notion that these things are to be understood literally, that he literally has hands, two right hands or loins. I think those are literal. The early Muslims thought they were literal. Salafi Muslims to this day think they're literal. Okay? Even if you get rid of that, you're still saying that there are a multiplicity of attributes in addition to Allah's essence, these eternal things that exist that he didn't make. There are as many exceptions, G.F. Haddad said, there are as many exceptions to the statement Allah created everything as there are attributes. Those attributes weren't created. And you can intercede with Allah through them. And they'll appear on the day of judgment and intercede for you. Okay? Shabir says this has to be granted by Allah. Okay, so we have eternal entities like the Quran that are going to appear as a pale man that Allah has granted the right of intercession. What pagan at the time of Muhammad wouldn't have said the same thing? They all believed that these gods were subordinate to Allah and that he was the one who granted them the right of intercession. And I'll conclude with that. My time is up.
Thank you, Dr. Rogers. Okay, now let's give him a proper round of applause for all their hard work that they've done for us.